coming, and Stephanie, thank you for that. I didn't actually write that. I felt at times where I was like, oh my gosh, this is my propaganda machine getting through. Thank you for those kind words. So I chose this metaphor of highways because we're going to go all over the place. You saw that the title of this, right? Conspiracy, complaints, and fraud. We're going to go in a bunch of different things. Let me just sort of give you the lay of the land. So I really want to begin by sort of showing you how computational linguistics and linguistics in general works in industry and solving business problems. So I'm going to spend some time sort of diving into that, and I expect that some of you will have questions now or later about that. I want to focus at the beginning really on fraud and sort of walk you through how do people use sort of linguistic markers to help detect fraud, and what is the scope of this and why would you do this? And then also, this can be both for companies to save money, right, to stop fraud, and it can also be for governments to find bad actors, right? And then I'm going to, sort of the more linguistic-y aspect here is going to be looking at the word because. And I want to sort of track through how people are really using this. And I want to get your thoughts also about where next that should go. But really, when you look at this data, you're going to see a bunch of stuff around rationalization and reasons and rationale and these sorts of things. And so that got us really interested in how because works. This is a very full slide deck. I'm going to like whiz through a few of these items, but you'll be able to get these online later if you want to, for example, look at the literature review, etc. And in particular, we'll be looking at consumer complaints and conspiracy and subreddits about sort of things like what's really going on in the world. Okay, so I want to just show you what $1 trillion is like. $1 trillion would, get you pretty close to the moon if you could like climb it. That's not a really stable structure, so don't do that. But that's what we're really talking about, right? So like $10,000, it's like up to your shoe, right? 100 million. This is a billion, right? So you've got all these like forklifts of money near you, and then $1 trillion is just a lot. So the estimate of losses to fraud worldwide is 3.7 trillion, right? So we're talking about big amounts of money going on in the world where people are, generally it's actually not huge amounts at any one time, but you have a lot of it all the time. So there really is a lot of stuff going on that you'd want to detect. And not only does this sort of steal money from sort of the corporations, but it also it usually comes out of and creates really bad working environments, right? So this is like just a bad system. When you have fraud going on, there are bad actors and groups, and usually the conditions, if they don't already suck, they're going to suck, right? It's either a canary in the coal mine or it's emblematic that there's something broken in this organization. So you can see these names, right? We've had companies go, fall down because of fraud and the scale of it, right? So you guys all know Enron. Some of these other ones will be more or less familiar to you as well. I'm just going to sort of show this to you to sort of remind you that yes, big companies have big fraud problems sometimes. This is totally illegible to you out there, but let me tell you what it is. It's basically the kinds, when we talk about fraud, what kinds of fraud are there? Well, there's corruption, right? So that's bribery, those sorts of things. There's asset misappropriation. That's really the big one where you just sort of take, like you go to the cash box and you take money out and you put it in your pocket, right? So that's a very significant one, although the amounts tend to be very small. And then there's financial statement fraud, right? This is where you're actually obligated to sort of say what you know and what's coming up in your quarterly reports, and you're lying about it, right? So let's look at some of the amounts here. This is not quite as legible as I'd like it to be. So what you should see here is that financial statement fraud is really responsible for the giant ones, right? So you end up with these like multi-million-dollar fraud things. Once you're in that category, you're really at the extreme end of a lot of money. When it comes down to asset misappropriation, it's really just kinds of, maybe like $100,000 per fraud case. So this is the evidence accumulated worldwide from the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. So this is what these people do and how they, what they report. Basically, you have, the most fraud is really going to happen in banking and financial services. Although the amount, in general, the median amount is $200,000. In mining, there's less of it, but boy, people are really taking $900,000 as the median there. So it's not a lot of the evidence, but apparently when you get into mining, you're really going to grab a bunch of dough. So you can see that these affect different industries differently, right? And in part, this has to do with the structures of companies, which always match sort of the industry, the sort of needs that they're serving, right? So companies have different structures depending on what industry they're in. So when it comes down to it, it's really, if you want to care about the big dollars, what you care about are the people at the top of the food chain, right? So yes, lots of people in purchasing and accounting and warehousing and inventory can steal stuff, but it's really upper management executives, board of directors, and people in sort of the finance departments that are really doing a lot of the sort of fraud that is high dollar. You can sort of look at red flags for fraudsters, and this is what you'll find. You'll say, oh, is this person living beyond their means? Do they have financial difficulties? Do they have unusually close associations with vendors or customers? Are they really unwilling to share duties? Do they not take vacations? These are also signs. So at this point, let's pause and think about how many of these are really linguistic in nature, right? So this is an email where somebody says, oh no, I'm not going to do this, right? You could look at vacation time maybe on your HR website, who's claimed or not claimed, but really it's the amount of sort of interaction, like how much am I emailing that vendor? Boy, I emailed them a lot, right? So there's regularity, but there's also the language. And that's part of what we're going to be looking at, is not just the sort of structural things that you can count, but also what's in the meaning of the communications between these individuals. And the losses are rarely recovered, right? So this is almost, the majority really don't see any money recovered from the fraud. So once there's fraud, it's gone, basically. You might get a little bit of it back, but usually not very much. So I had you guys read this paper on deception. And so if some of you did, it's a neat paper because what it does is it looks at earnings calls. And it says, okay, well, we know what these CEOs and CFOs said during these Q&As. And then we know if they had to do any sort of restatements of those finances. And so they looked at a variety of different thresholds to say, well, at this level, maybe you want to count it as deception, maybe not, but at this level, you definitely, everybody's on board. This is a huge restatement. They must have gone into this call knowing something was weird, and they were making different claims, right? So what's nice about this is that, in general, a lot of deception studies really just, they work on word lists, they work on experimental data. Experimental data is great, but when it really comes to deception that matters in the real world, you'd love to have some valid data in the real world. And that can be hard to come by, right? You might think about using police statements. Okay, but what are you counting as truth, right? Guilty verdicts? Well, that's going to be replete with all sorts of social factor problems where, guess what? People who are found guilty are not necessarily guilty. And so what you're really detecting is just what sort of interviews lead to sort of social structures that people are even identified as possibly alleged criminals and then found guilty. Right, so there are lots of problems with getting deception studies that really work. And so one of the advantages of this paper is that they found a thing that really does seem to have a signal, and they found a source where they could plausibly say, yes, this is deceptive. Or maybe if you wanted to say they're not finding deception, then you have to say, okay, well, these are organizations where the CEO and or the CFO are super ignorant of what's going on. Right, okay, so maybe we're finding ignorance, but I think deception is probably more likely here. And so they have a nice amount of data, right? So, and this in general, the data that they're using is available for other people to get as well. These earning calls are out there in the public domain. It's nice that they used those things. And then, of course, you notice that just depending on how strict they are with the definition, either 14% of their CEOs and CFOs were lying, or 5%, right? So, pick your level of lying. So they found a bunch of different factors to matter, right? And one thing that does happen if you read that paper is that the signs kind of change depending on where they put the threshold. So there are some questions that we might have about, well, how do we do this? And having so many definitions, this seems to actually be pretty hard to track, like which things really matter. But in general, you end up finding a lot of these sort of linguistic features do seem to matter. And so it's nice to sort of see also a version in which you say, well, let's find the linguistic signals that matter from the data itself, right? They talk in their literature review about all the word list approaches, right? And you can sort of say, well, if somebody says, I am lying, that's definitely, we should have a phrase in the dictionary about that. But those word lists are pretty hard. Just as in sentiment, it's pretty hard to get accurate sentiment if you're just saying, let's just list all of the good words and all the bad words. That's pretty hard to get accurate. So this is going to lead to sort of a different approach, which is in some ways what we at Idibon are doing, and so I'll be walking through that in a moment. But first I'd like to show you the boop boop machine. So what you really want to be able to do is you put data in, and then you get structure out. Right? That would be your perfect scenario. It would automatically just sort of, whatever your data is, it might be emails, it might be social media, it might be customer support calls, whatever it is, you put it in the machine, and the machine tells you they're lying, or they love your product, or this is about an epidemic that's spreading through West Africa, right? So you want to have this sort of automatic classification so you can really work at scale. So you can use text analytics for all kinds of things. I'm going to speak a little bit about the financial domain. At the very end of this talk, I'll give you some insights into some non-financial service things, and we'll talk about other applications as well. But basically, you end up with, there's compliance monitoring, search, e-communication surveillance. Technology-assisted review is basically, if you say, well, if you have, let's say you're an auto manufacturer, and everybody discovers that you were selling a car that was eco-friendly, but it's not, you're going to get sued, and you're going to have to turn over all sorts of emails. Well, right? Well, guess what? You could bury them in email. You have a lot of email. But how are they going to find the people who are suing you are going to want to find the smoking gun. How do you find that efficiently? Sentiment analysis, deception detection, text summarization, all of these are processes and things that you can do to help make these things happen and help automate things that are just too big for any human to just sort of sort through and be like, yes, this goes in this bucket, yes, this goes in this bucket, over here, over there. That just won't scale. That only works if you have a small amount of data. So in the world of sort of thinking about fraud, you start with 100% of data. And so this, again, can be anything. It could be because people commit fraud with email. They have internal chat systems. They have social media that they can use, right? So one thing that people are really interested in is insider trading using Twitter. So when do people start talking about bananas that never talk about bananas? And what are they saying? These are the anomaly detection becomes important there. So you start with 100% of data, and it's way too much. So you've got to bring it down. So you might just sort of say, well, what are the key entities, right? I already know like the project names, and I know the people that I sort of suspect. So I can come up with some lists that will help me narrow. And I can also use things like topic modeling to sort of find where in the data. I don't really care about the Christmas greetings. Maybe there's really interesting fraud stuff there, but that's not the first place to look, right? Oh, this is about HR policies. Let me look in there, right? So that you can filter down to now 30% of the data. Then you can sort of get rid of irrelevant stuff. You'll have a lot of stuff that's still spam that made it through your spam filters. You'll still have a bunch of stuff that is newsletters, right? You're signed up, you're actually in the fraud department, like the anti-fraud department. You're going to have all sorts of words that you just want to get rid of. And then near deduplication, that's a big problem with the data, is that you don't really want to have 20 versions of this email that we did a giant CC chain, right? We just really want one representation of that. And then once you get down there to this like smaller amount, then you can really do risk scoring. So what I'm going to move on to next is really risk scoring, but not quite yet. So you can have a top-level, top-down approach, right? I'll just find every occurrence of bribe. Okay, so that's going to have some problems. You can also do bottom-up discovery, right? So look and find examples of actual fraud and then train from there. In general, what we see is this sort of progress of machine learning, right? So at the beginning, you have these sort of rule-based, and they're very brittle, but you're entering all the things you think of as being relevant to this topic, right? Then you get simple machine learning, but you have to have sort of classes that you can categorize, and you have to have enough data. Deep learning helps solve some of that problem. We position ourselves down here because what we believe in is really about the human in the loop. Right, so that you don't just have a human, really producing the data in the first place, and you don't just have the human at the other end kind of interpreting the data, but you have people in the middle, if they're fraud examiners or whoever, reviewing the data and classifying it so that the system itself gets better, right? So this human in the loop aspect. One of our clients did a lot of stuff in energy compliance regulation, and they spent a lot of time on rules. And so then we just sort of took a bunch of their documents and had them hand classified, and we looked at the machine learning classifications, and we looked at their rules. And so their rules were great in many ways, but they didn't cover very much, right? Because we're just not really great at coming up with rules. There are categories where we're really good about exhaustively listing everything that possibly could be in this category, but in general, rules are brittle and they end up being problematic. So this is one way that you can sort of think of a system, right? So you have any kind of data here and you have your questions. People always come to industry knowing some of the categories they care about, right? So you have, pressure and emotions and capabilities and opportunities. You also want to, one of the first things that we heard and the reasons that we support LDA in our products is because people know that they don't know what they don't know. So you can also look at the topic modeling and say, oh, that's in the data, I care about that too. So then you can come up with this ontology that's what you already knew you cared about, plus these things that now you know are in the data and that you know to care about now as well. That leads you to this kind of process where you have human review. That trains a model that's on your specific data, which gives you the machine learning, which gives you the prediction. So now some new piece of data can come in, gets a prediction, and you can just sort of send it along its way. Yes, this is relevant and it's in the following category and I'm really confident. Of course, some of the things that come in, the model doesn't know what to do with. So you want to have some sort of optimization scheme by which you say, this needs a human. And if you send the right ones to a human, then you can update your machine learning, and then you can kind of keep the machine learning models getting smarter and smarter all the time, and you're making optimal use of the humans that are in the loop. I think that this is a little bit too much text for today, but basically, when it comes to fraud, one of the ways that you use text analytics is you identify the language that you think is there. You're trying to model fraud in the particular organization. You're trying to make sure that you can do it for all the groups within your organization, or often the people who do this are consulting firms, so they want to do this across organizations. And then you want to sort of keep and have a thing in place that just sort of tracks risk all the time. And so the way that you do this, you might look at sort of automatically detecting strategic communications. So one of my favorite models that we built is detecting whether something essentially has a BCC or not. So people talk differently when they BCC people than they do when they don't BCC anyone. So you can build models, of course, from that kind of thing. The fraud triangle and fraud diamond I'm going to talk about more. Key entities is really about finding named entities, people, organizations, project names. Personal messages, you can find ones that are more about projects versus more about interrelationships. Sentiment analysis helps you find positive stuff. And also, taboo words and obscenity can be useful when things are hot and heated, people use those words. They also use them a lot in jokes. Most of them in Enron, for example, in the Enron corpus are really just dirty jokes that people are sending to very surprisingly large lists of people. Topic modeling is useful when you want to understand. So this is topic modeling part of the Enron corpus. And when you do this, right, you start getting rid of like, this topic here is a lot of stuff about like weekends and holidays. Don't look there. This little thing here, however, is about, right, I also find the advanced ethical waiver language repugnant, but couldn't agree to it, and all the other modifications mentioned could be made. Here's one where people are talking about changing HR policies, which is kind of iffy in this particular case. Here's stuff about the merger that they were doing. So you can, topic modeling gives you this ability to sort of hone in on corners of the data, right? That's nice. And then if you layer it over with sentiment, right, you can say, okay, well, wow, these really are not showing up. Basically, these ones down here, the most negative, happen to be antitrust and mergers and acquisition conversations. And these ones up here are topics where people are talking about, positively about product releases and things like that. So this is the fraud triangle. And it talks about somebody is going to be a fraudster if they use a lot of rationalization, if they're under pressure, like they are a gambler and they're heavily in debt, and if they have the opportunity, right? So they're in the accounting department, et cetera. So pressure is incentives, wants, and needs. That's linguistically discussed, right? Like these sorts of things are things that you can find in language. Opportunity is weaknesses in the system that allow for fraud to happen, right? So that can be systemic, but it's also the linguistic element of this is like, we can do this, or we've done this before. There are linguistic attributes here as well. I'm going to skip rationalization and come back to it. There's a fourth one if you want to make a fraud diamond. This is the ugly fraud diamond from the original literature on this, but diamonds are our best friend. Capability, and this has to do with personal attributes, right? So effective lying, immunity to stress, intelligence, confidence. Guess what? You guys know from especially a lot of your psycholinguistic work, these are also detectable in text. So now let's talk about rationalization, which is committing fraud is worth the risk. People are rationalizing. So how do people do rationalization? We might describe this as defined by self-deception by reasoning, right? So reasoning becomes this important part for this corner of the triangle or the diamond. So how do they do it? So I want to talk about because. And I'm going to start by talking about Xerox and copying machines. How many people have ever waited in a line for a photocopier? I mean, some of us have. So, I mean, there might be a new generation that's like, I don't know what you're talking about. So one of my favorite studies basically took the undergrad campus long line, and they had people come up and they said, excuse me, I need to make some copies. One condition. Excuse me, I need to make some copies because I'm in a rush. In another condition, I need to make some copies. Can I cut in line because I need to make some copies, right? So let me give you the exact wording, right? So excuse me, I have 5 or 10 pages, may I use the Xerox machine? Excuse me, I have 5 or 10 pages, may I use the Xerox machine because I'm in a rush, because I have to make copies, right? So this is empty, right? Because I have to make copies, obviously. So what did they find? They found that basically, if you said because or the empty because, you'll get, yeah, and it's 5 pages, sure, go ahead, go, yeah. If it's effortful, if it's like, oh my God, I'll be here forever if you cut in front of me right now with 20 pages, remember this is back in '78, then no, they're gonna like require more information. What do you mean you need to make copies? Obviously, but they only detect that with the effortful condition. So because does some nice things. I'm going to skip through here, but I guess the main point here is a lot of people have looked at this as given and new information, right? So thinking about because clauses, they can go in either order, like many things, right? I can say because X result, or, which is much more frequent, result because X. So that's just the order that people do this in. This is interesting because really there's a significant finding that usually you actually make clausal statements not just because you're kind of explaining the world or giving reasons, but you're really backing up previous statements that someone might not accept or that they might be challenging, right? So you don't just give reasons out of nowhere, you kind of are anticipating challenges or responding to them. The conversational analysts often work with very little data, but they work really carefully at it. And so I like their way of thinking about because as sort of avoiding dispreferred terms, right? So if I say, hey, can you go out for dinner with me tonight? And I see that Stephanie's not responding because I know of a great place, but you might be busy because you have this whole thing going on. I'll make the because statement myself, or if she does, she'll use a because statement so that you have this kind of avoidance of saying, yeah, no, I'm not going to do that. There's some interesting cross-linguistic aspects. So what the important thing of this slide is basically that other languages do this differently. And so in English, we use because both when it's very objective, because I owe $10,000, and very subjectively, because I don't know what to do, right? So both of these happen. This isn't the case in all languages. Also for you that are psycholinguists, you might be interested that because clauses are sort of acquired relatively late in life compared to and statements or and then. They're not that late in life, but they're just later on. But if you do reading time experiments and memory experiments, if I have a causal connective in there, you'll definitely remember it better and you'll read it faster, right? So this is a little bit of paradox. Wait, we acquire this later, it seems to be complex, but on the other hand, I'm gonna read it faster, right? So this is an interesting feature about cognition. We'll skip that one as well. Okay, so very quick disquisition about because X. This was the word of the year a couple of years ago. Because reasons, right? This is where you just have like a word after this, right? So mostly because YOLO, because school, because same, because no, because yes, because reasons, because lol, because bored, because I love you, because yeah, because I don't give a fuck, because I don't know, because swag. Swag is one of my favorite. It's like, yeah, we'll go into that in some other talk. In general, what people are doing is nouns, but they also do the compressed clauses. They also do adjectives and interjections, right? So you're already getting a sense of possibly where I'm going, which is that there are emotional aspects, affective aspects to how people give reasons. And that's going to be a major theme of what's coming next. This is the soap opera the soap opera corpus that Mark Davies has at BYU. The number one highest mutual information with because is jealous in the soap opera database. Because you're jealous, because I'm jealous, because you know how jealous she gets. I love that. So let's look at the British parliamentarians, right? So one of their most frequent, this is not the number one, is frightened, right? Because I am frightened, because I am frightened, because I am frightened. Frightened because, right? So there is sort of emotional stuff. Why do people give reasons? Well, they give it in partly they're expressing what's happening with them, and that's part of a causation, right? Or part of a result. We report things that are affecting us. So affect and emotion are really bound up, right? So some people want to divide these and be like, it's reasoning or it's emotion. No, there's lots of evidence that actually emotion is underneath reasoning. In particular, it's because emotion tends to drive our attention and our motivation functions, right? So that's why it's going to play an important role here. And so in the next slides, I'm just going to show you some other ways that people encode emotion and language in some surprising ways. In Tongan, you can put it in a determiner. So instead of the, like the patient, I can express sympathy in the that I use in Tongan. In Navajo, I can sort of say that I'm doing a narrative, but I'm giving emotional evaluation. Here's my marker that lets you know that I'm doing that. In Korean, evidentials and psych predicates, evidentials are not emotionally neutral. How you sort of give evidence in Korean has this emotional element. In East Caucasian languages, there are cases for emotion experiences that are not the same as people who are perceiving things. In Thai, there's also a complementizer for emotional and evaluation stuff. So you can think of a that says, okay, I'm into an evaluation mode. So now I'm going to move into the sort of major two foci. That's the right Latin word. Focuses. I'm going to go Anglo-Saxon. Which is going to be consumer complaints about banks, and on the one hand, and then conspiracy. So this is UDAP. So unfair, deceptive, abusive acts or practices. Basically, what happened is that Dodd-Frank was passed, and it meant that banks and financial service companies can't defraud you, right? They can't mislead you. There are standards that they have to do for their language. And so these are kind of definitions. This is the length in pages of the Dodd-Frank Act of 2012. It's 2,300 pages. These are other financial legislations. The Graham-Leach-Lilly bill in '99, it's 145. Back here, the Federal Reserve Act in 1913 was only 31 pages. I mean, we're talking about a lot of documentation and a lot of rules and regulations. This is what the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau says on their website. We've secured almost $11 billion for relief for consumers harmed by illegal practices in the financial marketplace. It's a big statement. Now, it's not to the moon, right? Like it's not 3.7 trillion, but 10.8 billion, that was a couple of forklifts, that's a lot of forklifts. You need a warehouse for that amount of money. So the data source in the next few slides is 21,000 consumer narratives, people writing to the CFPB and saying, I think this bank or this credit bureau is doing this bad thing, and here's my story. 25% of them have the word because in it. We're going to see in a moment what Reddit has, but this is very high. 25% means that there's a lot of reason given in here. Notice that you could also look at cause and cause and therefore and since. Since is the next most frequent, but most of the time it's actually used in these. It's actually the temporal since, like since 93, that kind of thing. It's much rarer for it to be the because kind of sense. Therefore is about, I think it's something like 10%, whereas this is 25%. Word counts really vary. So if you have a narrative that has the word because in it, you're twice as long, right? So people giving reasons are wordy people. And we're going to find this more later on as well. People are also pretty happy to include multiple becauses. And in fact, sometimes you get these structures where it's X because Y because Z, right? In one long sentence. But in general, yes, the majority is single because. Also, I would say that just to tell you, almost all of these are result, comma, because. Only about 5% of them are because X then result. So they happen much more in bank accounts or services or mortgages than they do in credit reporting. These are things where you're saying Experian says that I owed this bill and they're making my credit rating terrible, but they shouldn't, because of this. They're not using because in those examples. And debt collection, where usually they're saying, they're coming and taking away my car, blah, blah, blah. People are not using because very often in those. These are all very frequent narrative types, but these are much more likely to have a because in them. And that's also partly, you're going to see why in a moment. So just to give you a sense of this, right, so the result is we strongly suggest someone look into Citi Mortgage's business practices because at best they are completely incompetent and at worst they are committing acts of fraud, right? So that's what I just said, it tends to be this order, right, result then cause. And that's what everybody finds in literature. You almost never begin with because in speech. You do get a lot more in writing, but it's never very much. So I want to talk about objectivity and subjectivity here. Like we've seen that in the literature, and I just wanted to sort of start coding this. So I want to talk about objective as something verifiable. Maybe true or false, I don't care. I just want to say that it's objective if I could prove it, if I just had a transcript, right? So they said I owed $10,000. If I had a transcript of that speech, then I'd know that yes, they did or they didn't do it, but that I'm going to call objective. Because I don't know what to do. I don't know how to prove whether they know what to do. A script doesn't help me do that, so I'm going to call that subjective. So the inter-annotator agreement, this is something that we do naturally in our in our work, because when you're doing custom categories, you want to make sure that your experts can actually agree on what things are and that they have high agreement, right? Otherwise, you're going to build machine learning models on data that even people can't get right. So for this, we actually have very high agreement. The closer to 1 you are, the happier you are. 0.85 for a span task where you're literally selecting, this is an objective case, this is a subjective case, the cause, this is an objective result, etc. It's highest for objective cause, lowest for the objective result. And the reason for this is that it's unclear exactly what's in scope. Sort of where you should begin the results clause is a little bit harder for people to do, but it's still very high. And they're all pretty easily distinguishable. One thing that you can do is you can test, well, what if I collapse these categories? Maybe they're just subjective and objective causes are meaningless. Let me collapse them. No, people do worse then, or no better. So this is our company. We're 30 people. I think this is about everyone. So special thanks at this point to Jason, who's our CTO, and comes from sort of detecting fraud and doing a lot of this work in consulting firms, and Nick, who actually we he does kind of psycholinguistics at UT Austin and sort of thinking about words as well as what his background was in. So they helped me with some of this, so I want to call out them. So 40% of the sentences that are in there are basically both subjective results and subjective causes. So causes really are an important part of what people are up to. 33% are sort of all objective, and then the rest are these mixed things, right? So you do get this thing of just sort of empirically with high agreement between three people who sort of decided on the definition of it and didn't talk to each other. You get people saying, yes, we tend to have a lot more subjective things than objective things. Not a lot more, but more. And we tend to match them, right? So they're both objective or they're both subjective. I tend to hate word clouds, but I thought that in this particular case, when I got it narrow enough, it would be useful. So these are subjective causes, the words that occur here, and these are the objective causes. And they're basically scaled so that they're pretty similar anyhow in their total counts. So here, these guys use these words as well, but now, mortgage, home, loan, money, right? So people in the subjective realm, I think that home is the most powerful one here, because you're clearly emotional when you talk about your home, right? And mortgages, right? Like, these are people who are in distress. They may be right or wrong, but they're in distress of some sort, or they're faking it because they want to try to get something. But regardless, part of what's happening here is it's an emotionally loaded thing, especially when you're at risk or have just lost your home. So it also, affective information seems to get length. The most significant effect here that's significant really is subjective causes. So subjective causes are just much longer than everything else. The other differences are not statistically significant. Some of them are close. Objective results and causes are close, but that's the real effect, is that when you're talking about these affective emotional causes, you also are going on longer. So let me give you some examples of subjectivity causes. Because I found out they've dealt fraudulently with many, many customers, because the matter has not been handled in accordance with the law, because now Springfield Beach Financial would not work with the new trustee of the trust, because NationStar has dragged its feet in the face of its significant error, right? So you get all sorts of linguistic signals that you want to detect, right? So what would you build? Not only would you want to detect these individual words and bigrams and trigrams, these words and phrases, but you want to detect how people use capitalization, right? This affective all caps is going to give you some signal, right? You see that twice here. You have people actively talking about legality and fraud, right? So these are important. When a customer goes to the CFPB and complains about this stuff, the CFPB is going to levy those fines. So if you're a bank, you really care about this. You really care about actually getting your customer service up to snuff enough so that you know when they're about to go to the CFPB before they do it, because you're going to have a whole bunch of chaos once the CFPB is being like, hey, tell us about your mortgage process. Tell us more. We have this complaint that you're misleading people, right? So you want to know that ahead of time. So you want to track it in your own consumer sort of reports and support data. So this is a neat training set as well for understanding other data sets. Now let me sort of tell you what they're just talking about. So this is really why this is going on and why you're going to feel like these end up being so subjective. Because they are talking about breakdowns in process, and guess what? When processes around your home or credit break down, you feel it. Unresponsiveness, that's irritating. Misrepresentation, right? So that's not good, and it's highly illegal, right? That UDAP that I showed you, super relevant. Omission, right? Did not tell me, that's also illegal. So basically in UDAP, you are held responsible for what you say and your silences, right? So what you don't say is also something that you're held responsible for. Emotion and subjective terms, so people really do talk about my fears, I'm angry, frustrated, you know, I was waiting patiently, it's not fair, struggling, pleading, these are the verbs that people use. They do dialogue acts, so this is really exciting and very tractable in terms of finding these kinds of things about requests and denies and thanks. Some categories are hard to find, but dialogue acts, you can find some of these. And then mortgage processes more particularly because, as you saw before, mortgages are a major domain of where people are complaining and where they're complaining and explaining because blah. So again, this is really a story of stuff that matters to people. But what about when people are interacting with each other? So let's go to Reddit. So Reddit is famous for having some problems. So can anybody clean up the front page of the internet, right? So there's a lot of people sort of piling on each other, right? So we've talked about fraudsters kind of defrauding companies. We've talked about companies defrauding consumers and consumers talking about it. Now let's talk about how people talk amongst each other. This, by the way, we did earlier work on toxicity and supportiveness within Reddit. We have a blog post on it if you want to go to our website. I think it's a really fun and interesting thing to detect toxicity and supportiveness within communities. I'm not going to talk about that too much here, except to say that do-it-yourself subreddit is super friendly. Go there, they will support you, they will not be jerks. And then I want to tell you that shit Reddit says, yeah, you're in trouble. Like, that's not a supported place. You don't go to shit Reddit says for support either, though. And you can also detect bigotry. So one of the worst ones is the red pill, and that's really basically a meninist, like anti-feminist, awful, misogynistic place. You will not be supported there. It's just full of awfulness. So be forewarned. Okay, so basically what I'm going to talk about, the amount of data I'm talking about, is all of Reddit, essentially, January through May of this year. It's 266 million posts from 96,000 forums. These are called subreddits, so I'm going to probably say subreddits instead of forums. The most popular overall is Ask Reddit with 21 million posts, then League of Legends. This is a gaming conversation. There are millions of people that watch these competitions between other game players. It's really fascinating. Funny, top picks, NFL, NBA, these are the other ones that have the most frequent posts. So most of these subreddits have about 5% of the posts have because of them. The top quartile is 7%, and the bottom quartile is 4%. So you can see when I talk about the CFPB data having 25%, that, oh, wow, that's that's really, we're doing something special in there, right? Like clearly that's a reason given place. Also, if you study sentiment, guess what? It's all negative sentiment. Nobody writes in CFDB being like, well, I love my loan agent. Okay, so let's just talk about the most because-y subreddits. Change my view, debate a Christian, purple pill debate, right? So they're actually things that of course they have reasons being given. Purple pill debate is basically, okay, so there's the red pill, I told you that's kind of lousy and bigoted. Well, there's also the blue pill, and the purple pill is kind of a in-between, let's talk about this thing. You can see some examples over here. There are problematic things there, let's just be honest. That's all of them. My personal favorite is that relationships are very because-y. I have not, because I've been focusing on conspiracy, I have not dived into this to see how much is that because being like, okay, here's what you need to do because a good relationship is like this, so advice giving, versus like, well, I did this because I was really pissed, or like he did this because an attribute. So I don't know that. If someone wants to study that, I think it's really exciting. It's clearly prominent. Here are the least because-y, so you won't be surprised. Plaza Podemos is Spanish, so no, you don't use because, you can use Spanish. The next one is Japanese, and so no, you don't use Japanese there either. You also tend not to, when you're doing role-playing, like X-Men role-playing, you just don't give reasons. And also Percy Jackson and the X-Men, at least those communities don't give reasons. Okay, so dollars we've talked about a lot. I mean, let's go here, right? So let's go to conspiracies. This is, by the way, what's really happening on the dollar bill, but I'm just going to pass through it. Okay, so thanks for this part to Jana and Carissa, who started, Carissa was one of our interns over the summer. Jana is one of our NLP engineers. They started a project that got my attention on the conspiracy subreddit because they wanted to know what made people sound paranoid. So they started running experiments to figure out for other people that are in that community what actually is paranoia and what sounds like reasons. That's ongoing, so I'm not going to report much from it, but it really is in some ways the impetus of why I'm talking about this. Okay, so there are 385,000 posts in conspiracy, and 30,000 of them, so about 7.81%, so that's high, that's above the top quartile, but it's not as high as relationships. And because tend to score higher for controversiality, this is part of if you get all the data from Reddit, you'll get a score for controversiality. That's a thing that happens more with becauses. But the thing that really stands out is the length, right? So here's the length of things that have because, and here are the length of posts that don't have because. This is true across subreddits, but this is also specifically here in conspiracy. So I want to take a view of the authors. So I'm going to count deleted because authors get banned and deleted. I'm going to count them as authors. And I'm going to count, but one author, a single author. An auto moderator, which is just a kind of account. I'm still going to count that as a moderator. There are 32,000 different users who posted in this time period. About 1,000 of them have 50 or more posts in this time period. So the median number of posts with because is 7.19. And the top quartile is 11.43, and the bottom quartile is 4. So this is sort of how many of these people who have 50 or more posts are, like what are they doing? What are their predilections, right? Because maybe there are just some people out there that are just really big becausers. So here are some examples from some big because users. Those who pay decent rent are doing so because they've been living in a rent-controlled area for a long time. So that's preceded by a paragraph about rent prices. And there's the all caps evaluative. So notice that this really is a nice story, the psycholinguistic story of given and then new information. That's really how the structure is common in here. So because it's minor at first, that would possibly embolden them, you can't be serious, right? So this is, one of my favorite analyses of so versus O is that O is really about expressing kind of an instant, oh, surprise, and I'm communicating it to you. And so is more of like, I'm gonna reel in the interactive thing that just was happening. I'm going to prove that I was listening and paying attention. But here you're using it in this kind of adversarial way, right? So because, right, I'm asking this skeptical question. So because can be involved in these questions and rhetorical moves that people have. Slaves, are we literally whipped bloody when we don't do as master says, or just because he wants to? This is somebody who's really clear, like somebody is misusing the word slave and it's bullshit, and here I'm going to take you to task. It's very adversative. It actually ends with, do you have any clue what slavery really is, right? So this is common discourse is who's in conspiracies, and actually in economic conversations in general, is like, have we become slaves to corporations or the government or whatever entity? And so you get this pushback of like, well, what does that even mean? So here we also have another state where, guess what? Yes, these are people in conflict. So there are 384,000 posts in the time frame. Well, 385. They roll up to, most of them are singleton threads, right? So like there's a thread and it doesn't get followed. But a few of them have really long threads, right? So for threads that have 50 or more posts on them, there are only 144 of those, right? So mostly posts are just sort of float out there and nobody comments on them. But if we take threads that have 15 to 49 posts, there are 11,000 of them, then we see that sort of this median is more about like 6%, and then the top quartile is 11%, and the bottom quartile is, as you guess, 0. So threads themselves seem to have different propensities to becousing. Okay, so this is the Rumsfeld moment of we don't know what we don't know. I mentioned that earlier, and this is where topic modeling comes in. So this is topic modeling of all of the because statements in conspiracy. So what you have here is moderation, is that big gray one. So this is people banning people in discussions about that kind of thing. This one is meta-conspiracy, so it's how do you prove the conspiracy is happening? That's a big focus of conversation here. This is criticism, so this is like people criticizing other people, ad hominem attacks generally. This is the corporations bubble, where people are talking about government and corporations and these sorts of things, money. This is media, sort of who's covering what, what's getting not covered. There are a bunch of, this is about power, sort of systems and government and those sorts of things. So there's a wide range of topics here, and this is sort of how they are, this is a nice, topic modeling gives us a nice way of sort of seeing what the scale of these things are. So authors who like because really go to these topics. So our top users, the people who just are becausing all over the subreddit, they go to JFK stuff, they go to 9/11 buildings, they go to aliens, they go to the other 9/11, which isn't about the buildings being destroyed, and they go to space. You know, sort of all kinds of conspiracy around that. And they avoid, these sort of big becausers don't go to media, they don't talk about US politics. There are two JFK conversations. One is kind of about autopsies. The other one is more general purpose, and they're not going to that one. And they tend to not go to moderation, and they don't talk about, so there's a family harm topic as well, and they don't go there. Within because posts, the because-orific authors use a median of 901 characters, and the least because-y characters. So these are people who really don't like because, they don't use it very often, but now we're looking at their becauses, and they're much shorter, right? So they're 615 characters. So what is driving this? Is it just because users are wordy, or is it because they're hanging out in threads that are just more or less because-y? And the answer is going to be basically in this case, because some topics are just wordier than others is what's driving this proportion. So here's everyone's sort of longest because posts. These are the big becausers and the because avoiders. And basically, these are the top 5 for each of these groups. You can spend some time, but they're basically the ones that I already read to you. They're all the same. And the ones that aren't in one are pretty close. They're like 6 or 7 for the other ones. So they're basically all the same there. If we also look at the shortest posts, then we also see that they're also similar. So everybody tends to avoid having very long because-y criticism. If you're going to criticize someone, you'll get a because statement in there, and you'll be brief. If you're going to moderate someone, you'll give a because statement that's prominent, but then you get in and get out. Right? And that's just true whether you're a big becauser or not. So let's come back to this idea of fraud for a moment. So 7.8% of posts in conspiracy have because. And there are 16,000 that have language around fraud. This is a whole host of words, like even including bamboozle, which I love. And maybe I should call this talk bamboozle conspiracy. And at any rate, so we'd expect for about 1,300 posts to have both of them, just if everything were just distributed randomly. But we instead have close to 3,500, right? So there does seem to be this effect of when you're going to make accusations around illegality, fraud, and these sorts of things, you are going to be backing it up in a because kind of style. So let's go back to where we've been. So hopefully at this point, you've sort of, as we're wrapping up, you've seen sort of how we talk about computational linguistics, text analytics, solving business problems. I hope we'll talk about that more. I hope you've sort of seen some of the ways of identifying markers. That's that feedback loop of you have humans look at the data itself, and then you make a machine learning model for that, and then you make it smarter by having people look at it again. And then I hope that you sort of have seen some of the reasons that you might sort of build into looking at because in particular and honing in on that. This is clearly sort of, I'm really excited to hear what you think and sort of where you most are curious about sort of what's been said about because and sort of where next you want to go look or have me go look. Basically, the main sort of thing that I think about this is that there are links between rationalization and because usage that really help with applications of fraud and dealing with customer complaints. And the ways that these sort of ways that people give reasons really tell us about their psychological state. And that's important both for understanding who's the most upset and who's going to complain the loudest and most vociferously, and who's a fraudster, right? So these help in multiple, understanding psychological states can help in multiple ways. I want to show you a different visualization. That's $1 trillion. I want to sort of say again, the important thing in business is winnowing down to the stuff that matters. So you're always looking for ways of accurately getting down to things that are actionable, because you tend to have to sift through a mountain of data. If you're not sifting through a mountain of data, you should just sit down and read everything and be like, okay, this is the hand categorization. So even though I've been talking about a boop boop machine that is like automatic and does this thing and trains itself so it can just sort of do everything, there are people in this. So one of our favorite use cases is working with UNICEF. U-Report is basically a way that UNICEF finds out like what's happening, in particular in African countries. And so they originally just started it sending out surveys. You sign up, and then I'll text you A through E. What do you think of the environment or maternal health or these sorts of things? But it got out from once people were signed up for this, they didn't just answer the things that they were prompted to answer. They did that, and then they started writing, there's corruption in my village. Is it true that Ebola can be cured by salt water? No one has been paid in my village for the last 2 weeks, right? So all of these things happened. So the U-Report staff was inundated. These are in 12 different languages. They had a lot of things happening, right? You want to route these to the right person, right? And you want to sort of say, it's this topic, it's this level of actionability, here you go over here. Because clearly the people who deal with economic issues at the UN are not the same as people who should be handling health questions. So what that really means is that when we think about the filtering process, yes, there's a sort of complicated machinery that's in place, but it's also very human. It's a human scale. Humans produce data, humans interpret data. The filtering process is really both a craft and an art, and it's really about serving people's needs. Thank you very much.